in hip-hop. There are some names you don't argue about lightly, and Biggie is one of them. So when a conversation involving Tony, Yayo, and Jadakiss suddenly shifted toward the notorious B.I.G.'s legacy, the energy in the room changed instantly. Not because anyone planned beef, not because anyone wanted to smoke, but because Biggie's name doesn't invite opinions, it demands respect. What started as a normal hip-hop discussion quickly turned tense. Voices didn't rise, but convictions. Did loyalty to eras? Loyalty to boroughs? Loyalty to personal history? And once those loyalties clash, even legends don't get mentioned the same way. Tony Yayo comes from a camp where Biggie represents dominance, fearlessness, and impact that reshaped the streets and the industry. Jadakiss comes from a lineage where lyricism, survival, and authenticity define greatness just as much as chart success. Two valid perspectives, one untouchable name. And that's where things got complicated, because in New York hip-hop, and who earned the right to speak on certain chapters of history, fans watching could feel it. This wasn't a playful disagreement. This was legacy talk. The kind of conversation where nobody wants to disrespect the past, but nobody wants their reality erased either. And once Biggie's legacy entered the conversation, there was no neutral ground left. This wasn't beef. This was a reminder that some conversations in hip-hop are heavier than they sound, and once they start going left, there's no easy way to pull them back. Once Biggie's name entered the conversation, the discussion stopped being casual. That's how it always goes in New York hip-hop. There are debates you can play with, rankings, albums, eras, and then there are names that don't belong in playful arguments. Biggie is one of those names. Not because he's untouchable, but because he represents something deeper than preference. He represents the foundation. So when Tony, Yayo, and Jadakiss found themselves on opposite sides of a conversation that drifted toward the notorious B.I.G.'s legacy, the tone shifted instantly. No insults were thrown. No voices were raised. But the energy changed. Tony Yayo speaks from a perspective shaped by dominance. Coming from the G-Unit era, his understanding of greatness is tied to impact, how an artist shifted the culture, controlled the streets, and moved fearlessly in an industry that wasn't forgiving. He's a blueprint for authority in hip-hop. Biggie made artists feel pressure before streaming, before social media, before algorithms. His presence alone altered rooms. That kind of influence doesn't get measured in bars alone. Jadakiss comes from a different angle. His world is built on bars, longevity, and survival, about being able to rap anywhere against anyone and never lose credibility. For Jadakiss' legacy includes struggle, consistency, and lyrical respect earned over decades. So when Biggie's name comes up, Jadakiss doesn't hear just dominance. He hears context, where someone stood, what someone faced, how the streets actually responded. Both viewpoints are valid, but they don't always align. That's where the tension came from. This wasn't a who's better argument. It was a debate about what greatness actually means and who gets to define it. In New York hip-hop, definitions matter because they shape history. Tony Yayo's stance reflects an era where impact was immediate and unforgiving. Biggie's run was short, but it was seismic. He didn't need longevity to validate greatness. His presence was enough. Jadakiss respects that, but his reality is different. He comes from an era where survival itself is proof of greatness, where staying relevant, staying respected, and staying sharp across decades carries its own weight. So when Tony Yayo leaned into Biggie's dominance as the ultimate measure, Jadakiss pushed back, not against Biggie, but against the idea that dominance alone defines legacy. That's a subtle but important distinction. And that distinction is where things started to go left. Not because anyone disrespected Biggie, but because both men were defending their own lived experience in hip-hop. Lived experience carries more authority than statistics. That's why debates like this never stay surface level. They tap into identity. Tony Yayo isn't just defending Biggie. He's defending the era that shaped him. An era where power mattered, where fear mattered, where impact was measured by how fast the streets reacted. Jadakiss isn't minimizing Biggie, he's protecting the idea that longevity, resilience, and lyrical mastery deserve equal recognition. That greatness doesn't always look explosive. Sometimes it looks consistent. When those philosophies collide, tension is inevitable, and fans watching could feel it. This wasn't entertainment tension. It was cultural tension. The kind that reminds you New York hip-hop isn't one story, it's multiple stories overlapping, sometimes competing. Brooklyn doesn't see history the same way Queens does. Harlem doesn't measure impact the same way Yonkers does. And Biggie sits at the center of that complexity. He's universally respected, but universally interpreted differently. That's why his name ends debates or ignites them as the conversation continued. Neither Tony Yayo nor Jadakiss tried to dominate the other. That's what made the moment powerful. They weren't arguing to win. They were arguing to be understood. And that's rare. But rare moments carry risk, because once you start unpacking legacy publicly, fans project their own emotions onto the conversation. Clips get isolated. Context gets trimmed. Suddenly, a nuanced discussion starts getting framed as beef. That's when things really start going left. Not because of what was said, but because of how it gets replayed. Tony Yayo's loyalty to Biggie's impact can be read as dismissive of other forms of greatness. Jadakiss's insistence on nuance can be misread as downplaying dominance. Neither interpretation is accurate. But accuracy rarely survives virality. This is the stage where conversations get dangerous, not physically, narratively, because once the internet labels something as a clash, it demands escalation. And escalation ruins the very nuance that made the conversation meaningful in the first place. At this point, the room hadn't exploded, but the margin for misunderstanding is gone. Every next word mattered more than the last. Talking about Biggie isn't just talking about one man, it's talking about how New York defines itself, and how different generations remember the same history in very different ways. The moment clips started circulating, the conversation stopped belonging to the room. It belongs to the internet now. And the internet doesn't care about nuance. It cares about moments. A pause gets cut short. A sentence loses its ending. A calm disagreement turns into a headline. That's exactly what happened next. What was originally a layered discussion about legacy, impact, and perspective quickly got repackaged as a clash. Not because Tony Yayo and Jadakiss were beefing, but because the algorithm needs conflict to breathe. Fans picked sides almost instantly. Some felt Tony Yayo was right, that Biggie's dominance is unmatched, that his short run doesn't weaken his legacy, and that New York hip-hop wouldn't look the same without that presence. For them, the argument was simple. Impact beats longevity. Others leaned toward Jadakiss, arguing that greatness isn't only about how hard you hit, but how long you last. That's surviving eras, trends, and industry shifts while maintaining. Respect is its own form of dominance. Both sides argued passionately. That passion turned into pressure. Comment sections filled with absolutes. End of discussion, no debate. All disrespecting history. And once fans start using words like disrespect, things escalate fast. The nuance that existed in the original exchange began to disappear. Tony Yayo's loyalty to Biggie's era got reframed as dismissing other legends. Jadakiss's insistence on context got reframed as downplaying Biggie. Neither framing was fair, but fairness doesn't trend. The real danger here wasn't personal tension between two artists. It was how the culture was being nudged toward a false choice, as if respecting Biggie required ignoring everyone else, as if honoring longevity meant minimizing dominance. That false choice creates Division. And division is addictive online. Clips with neutral titles underperformed. Clips with snap, go left, or disrespect exploded. That alone tells you how narratives get shaped, not by truth, but by reaction. Tony Yayo didn't escalate publicly. He didn't jump online to clarify or argue. That restraint mattered. It suggested he understood what was happening, that the debate was being hijacked. Jadakiss handled it the same way. No long explanations, no defensive posts. Just silence. And silence at this stage was the smartest move, because responding to the internet's version of the story would have validated it. What fans often miss is that seasoned artists have seen this cycle before. They know how quickly a healthy debate can get weaponized. They know when to let a moment burn itself out instead of adding oxygen. Still, the pressure was real. Interviews started referencing the clips. Fans started tagging both names under unrelated posts. Every conversation about Biggie suddenly felt loaded. That's when you realize how powerful legacy conversations really are. They're never just about the past. They're about who gets authority in the present. Tony Yayo's argument resonates with people who believe impact defines greatness. Jadakiss's perspective resonates with people who value survival and consistency. Those values don't just apply to rappers. They apply to fans' own lives. That's why the reaction felt personal. And when things feel personal, logic fades. The Clash narrative also ignored something important. New York hip-hop has always thrived on debate. Barbershop arguments, ciphers, radio discussions. That culture is built on disagreement without disrespect. What changed wasn't the conversation. It was the platform. Online spaces reward extremes. So a balanced debate becomes a battle. Respectful disagreement becomes shots fired. That shift doesn't just misrepresent artists. It reshapes how history gets remembered by the time Part 2 unfolds fully. The conversation has drifted far from where it started. Biggie's legacy is still at the center, but now it's being used as a tool, a way to score points rather than understand history. That's the real loss, because when legacy becomes ammunition, nobody wins. Tony Yayo and Jadakiss both know. That's why neither took the bait. That's why neither fed the narrative. They let the internet argue with itself, and slowly, the temperature started to drop. Not because fans agreed, but because the moment lost freshness. New controversies arrived, new clips trended, tension shifted, as it always does. But something remained. A reminder that some conversations are heavier than they look. That talking about Biggie isn't just talking about one artist, it's talking about how New York defines greatness. And definitions don't change easily. The so-called Clash is already losing steam. Not resolved, just exhausted. The artists never went further, and without escalation, the narrative had nowhere to go. That restraint preserved respect, but it also set the stage for the next question, the one that always comes after the noise fades. What did this moment actually reveal about hip-hop, and why did it strike such a nerve? Once the noise started dying down, the real meaning of the moment finally had room to breathe. Because the truth is, the debate between Tony Yayo and Jadakiss was never about ego, disrespect, or competition. It was about definition in hip-hop. Legacy isn't a trophy you hand out, it's a language. And different generations speak that language differently. What felt like tension was really two philosophies colliding in public. Tony Yayo's perspective comes from an era where impact was immediate and unforgiving. When Biggie arrived, he didn't ease into greatness. He dominated. His presence shifted how rappers were judged, how labels moved, and how the streets reacted. That kind of impact doesn't need time to validate it. That's the logic Yayo stands on. From that angle, the Notorious B.I.G. isn't just a legend, he's a standard. A measuring stick for what happens when talent, timing, and fearlessness align perfectly. Jadakiss doesn't disagree with that, but his definition of greatness includes endurance. For Jadakiss, legacy isn't only about how hard you hit the culture, it's about how long you survive inside it without losing respect. The LOX era was about consistency through chaos. Labels changing, sounds shifting, trends rising and falling. Still standing, that experience shapes how you evaluate history. So when Jadakiss pushes for nuance, it's not minimizing Biggie. He's protecting the idea that hip-hop greatness can look different depending on where you stood and how long you lasted. That's why this moment struck such a nerve, because fans weren't just reacting to a debate. They were reacting to their own values being challenged. Some fans believe impact matters most. Others believe longevity defines greatness. Either belief is wrong, but they don't always coexist comfortably. And Biggie sits at the intersection of that tension. He represents a career so powerful that it feels complete despite its brevity. That alone challenges how we think about time, output, and validation. It forces uncomfortable questions. Is dominance more important than duration? Does influence outweigh survival? Can a short run outweigh decades of consistency? These questions don't have clean answers. That's why the conversation felt heavy in New York. Hip-hop has always been shaped by debates like this. Boroughs arguing, eras clashing, styles competing. That friction is part of what made the culture sharp. But the difference now is that those debates play out on platforms that flatten complexity. Online spaces don't allow room for both. Can be true. They demand winners. Tony, Yayo, and Jadakiss refused to give the internet one. That refusal mattered by not escalating. They preserved the integrity of the discussion. They allowed the moment to exist as a reflection instead of a feud. And in doing so, they modeled something rare: how to disagree without erasing respect. That's a lesson hip-hop doesn't always get credit for. As this moment settled, it quietly reinforced something important. Legacy isn't owned by one voice. It's built collectively, argued over, refined, remembered differently by different people. Biggie's greatness doesn't shrink because someone values longevity. Longevity doesn't lose meaning because Biggie dominated quickly. Both truths can stand. That's the part the internet missed, but the culture understood. The so-called clash reveals itself for what it really was: a mirror, a moment that reflected how deeply people care about history, respect, and where they place value in hip-hop. And moments like that don't need explosions to matter. They just need honesty. When moments like this pass, they don't disappear. They settle. They settle into how people talk, how future debates are framed, how legends are referenced with a little more care. That's exactly what happened here. The exchange involving Tony, Yayo, and Jadakiss didn't end with apologies or declarations because it never needed them. It ended the way many meaningful hip-hop moments do: quietly, with understanding. And that's why it matters. Hip-hop has always thrived on debate. But not every debate becomes a lesson. This one did, because it exposed something deeper than disagreement. It showed how legacy is fragile, not because it's weak, but because it carries so much weight. Mentioning the Notorious B.I.G. isn't like mentioning just any artist. His name isn't just history, it's identity for a city, an era, and a mindset. That's why conversations around him feel heavier. They're not academic. They're emotional. And emotions don't follow clean rules. What this moment ultimately highlighted is that hip-hop doesn't have one scoreboard. There isn't a single formula for greatness. Some legends define eras through dominance. Others define eras through survival. Some burn bright and fast. Others glow steadily over decades. New York hip-hop, more than any other scene, understands this tension. It was built on competition, but also on coexistence. Multiple kings, overlapping reigns, constant arguments, all held together by respect. For the culture itself, that's what Tony, Yayo, and Jadakiss represented in this moment. Two men from different camps. Two different paths. One shared understanding that some names deserve careful handling. The internet tried to turn that into a feud because conflict is easy to digest. But the culture rejected that framing. Not loudly, but effectively, by refusing to escalate. Both artists let the moment breathe instead of explode. That restraint sends a message. It tells younger artists and fans that not every disagreement needs to be turned into content. That legacy conversations don't require disrespect to be meaningful, and that sometimes the strongest move is letting a moment exist without forcing a conclusion. This is how hip-hop matures without losing its edge. Years from now, nobody will remember the clickbait headlines. They'll remember that two respected voices debated legacy without tearing each other down. They'll remember that Biggie's name still had the power to stop a room, not because of fear, but because of reverence. That's a real influence, and that's why this moment will last longer than most viral clips. It didn't change rankings. It didn't crown a winner. It didn't rewrite history. It reminded people that history is lived, not voted on. As the dust fully settles, the conversation around Biggie doesn't shrink. It deepens. People talk with more care, with more context, with more awareness that greatness isn't one-dimensional. That's growth. And in a culture often accused of feeding on chaos, moments like this quietly push back against that narrative. No beef, no fallout. Just perspective. In the end, this wasn't about Tony Yayo versus Jadakiss. It was about how hip-hop remembers its giants and how it learns to talk about them without tearing itself apart. That's why this moment mattered. Not because things went left, but because they didn't. Before you click away, take a second to really think about what this moment showed us. This wasn't about beef. It wasn't about ego. And it definitely wasn't about disrespect. It was about how hip-hop remembers its legends. The conversation between Yayo and Jadakiss reminded us that legacy isn't one-size-fits-all. Some legends are defined by dominance, others by longevity, and some, like the notorious Biggie, sit at the center of both conversations forever. Now, here's where you come in. Do you believe greatness is about impact, even if the run is short? Or do you believe survival and consistency define real legacy? Drop your honest opinion in the comments, not to argue, but to add to the culture. Respectful debate is how hip-hop stays alive. If you appreciate real breakdowns without fake beef or clickbait, make sure you like this video. Subscribe for more deep dive hip-hop stories that focus on history, context, and truth, not just headlines. And most importantly, stay locked in, because some conversations don't need to explode to matter. They just need to be heard. Hip-hop history is still being written, and your voice is part of it.